The city lights of Atlanta burned against the night sky like scattered embers, casting long shadows across cracked sidewalks where stories of injustice seemed permanently etched into the pavement. One such story began on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday evening, a story that would ripple far beyond the streets where it started. A black woman, dressed in simple workout clothes after a long day, was stopped by a white police officer on a dimly lit block. She hadn't committed a crime. She hadn't even been speeding or breaking any law. She had simply parked her car in front of a friend's apartment. But what unfolded next was a horrifying reminder that, for many, skin color alone was enough to justify suspicion, force, and violence. The officer approached aggressively, suspicion laced in his tone, and within moments the encounter turned physical. He pinned her against her own car, his forearm pressed hard across her neck. She gasped for air, her eyes blurring, her heart pounding in terror. Her mind screamed that this couldn't be happening, that she was not just a black woman, not just another statistic waiting to be buried beneath hashtags and protests. She was a judge, a respected figure who had sworn to uphold the law, not to be brutalized by it. But in that moment, he didn't see a judge. He didn't see a mother, a scholar, or a trailblazer. He saw only his own bias, and he acted on it with cruel certainty. What he could not have imagined was how the tables would turn. Days later, he would stand in a courtroom, his fate hanging in the balance. And the woman he thought he could choke into silence? She would be the one seated on the bench, gavel in hand, staring down at the man who once pressed the air from her lungs. This is not just a story about one night of brutality. It is a story about history colliding with justice, about power, race, and the extraordinary courage of a black woman who refused to be reduced to a victim. Her name was Judge Althea Monroe, and in the heart of Atlanta's sprawling justice system, she had become a symbol of resilience and integrity. Raised in a working-class neighborhood by parents who had fought their own battles against segregation, Althea grew up understanding the dual realities of America. Her father, a postal worker who marched during the civil rights movement, often reminded her that progress was never guaranteed. It was earned, fought for, and defended every single day. Her mother, a schoolteacher, instilled in her the discipline to chase education as both shield and weapon in a world eager to underestimate her. Althea had taken that wisdom to heart. She was one of the top graduates of Spelman College, and from there she fought her way into Harvard Law School, navigating spaces that were not built to welcome women like her. She endured the whispers of professors who doubted her intellect, the smirks of classmates who reduced her presence to affirmative action, and the crushing weight of being one of the few black women in lecture halls where power seemed to pass only from white hand to white hand. But she persevered. She excelled not only through brilliance but also through grit, pouring herself into the study of law because she knew her people's survival often hinged on it. Years later, she became a public defender, fighting tirelessly for men and women chewed up by a system stacked against them. It was in the cramped, underfunded defender's office where she sharpened her understanding of the law, not as a theory in a textbook, but as a lifeline for those who had nothing left but the hope that someone might believe in their humanity. Her work caught attention. Soon, she was appointed as a prosecutor, then elevated to the bench as a judge. In a profession still overwhelmingly white and male, she was a rare presence, a black woman with the power to weigh evidence, to decide fates, to deliver justice in a country that had so often denied it to her community. To the public, Judge Monroe was a figure of calm authority. She was not known for fiery speeches or dramatic rulings. Instead, she carried herself with the quiet, unshakable presence of someone who had seen injustice firsthand and was determined to chip away at it, case by case, decision by decision. But beneath the black robes and composed demeanor was a woman who carried scars, memories of being followed through department stores, pulled over for broken taillights that never existed, and treated like a trespasser in neighborhoods she had every right to walk. That night, when she parked outside her friend's apartment complex after an exhausting week of trials, she had simply wanted peace. The case she had presided over earlier had been emotionally draining. A young black man facing decades in prison over a crime he hadn't committed. She'd watched prosecutors lean on flimsy evidence, Police officers contradict themselves, and still, the jury wrestled with doubt. It was the kind of case that reminded her why her work mattered, but also why the fight never seemed to end. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Creighton patrolled that same neighborhood. To his colleagues, he was old school, a cop who believed respect was commanded, not earned. He had grown up in a suburb just outside the city, in a family that spoke openly of keeping order and knowing your place. His record was checkered with complaints of excessive force, but few had ever stuck. Each time a civilian filed a report, the blue wall of silence rose to protect him, fellow officers closing ranks while department brass wrote off the accusations as exaggerations. To him, every young black man was a potential suspect, every black woman a potential liar. He carried his badge like a weapon against communities he did not understand. That night, Creighton noticed Althea's car and grew suspicious. To him, a black woman stepping out of a late-model vehicle in a white-leaning neighborhood was cause for confrontation. He didn't recognize her face, and he certainly didn't imagine that the woman adjusting her gym bag over her shoulder was a judge whose name carried weight across the city. As Althea walked toward her friend's building, she had no reason to anticipate danger. She was off duty, unarmed, and carrying only her phone and keys. The air was warm and still, the streetlights buzzing faintly above her. But behind her, the patrol car slowed to a crawl, headlights flooding her figure with unwanted attention. She noticed it but kept walking, refusing to let paranoia dictate her steps. Within minutes, her ordinary evening was transformed into a nightmare. The sound of heavy boots striking pavement behind her sent an unease down Althea's spine. She turned slightly, noticing the uniformed figure approaching with the unmistakable authority of someone convinced he had the right to interrupt her night. Officer Daniel Creighton's flashlight beams swept over her like an accusation before his words even came. "Ma'am, what are you doing out here?" His tone was sharp, suspicious, dripping with the kind of assumption that no answer she gave would satisfy him. Althea calmly explained that she was visiting a friend who lived in the building ahead, offering her car keys as proof of ownership for the vehicle parked just yards away. But Creighton's eyes narrowed. His questions grew invasive, demanding identification, pressing her about where she worked, why she was there, and why at this hour. Years of experience in courtrooms had taught Althea how quickly these encounters could spiral. She knew the statistics, knew how often black people found themselves in grave danger during routine stops. She tried to remain composed, her voice measured, but beneath that calm exterior was a pulse quickening with fear. Then it happened. When she hesitated before reaching into her bag, careful not to make any sudden moves, Creighton's suspicion ignited into aggression. He grabbed her wrist, yanked her toward the hood of her own car, and shoved her against it with a force that rattled through her bones. His forearm pressed against her neck, cutting off her breath as he demanded compliance in a voice that brooked no humanity. Althea gasped, struggling to speak, but his weight only increased. The world blurred at the edges, sounds growing distant, as if her life was slipping through cracks she couldn't hold together. She thought of her mother, her father, the generations who had endured worse in the name of survival. She thought of the young defendants she had seen in court, their lives shattered by men in uniforms like his. And she thought of the cruel irony that she, a judge sworn to uphold justice, was now being choked by the very system she had dedicated her life to reforming. The assault lasted less than 2 minutes, but in those moments time stretched mercilessly. When a resident emerged from the building, startled by the commotion, Creighton finally released her. He warned her in a cold, dismissive tone before retreating to his squad car, muttering something about probable cause and suspicious behavior. Althea staggered upright, clutching her throat, humiliation and fury colliding in her chest. She wanted to scream, to curse him, to announce exactly who she was. But she didn't. Not that night. Not while he still had his badge, his gun, and the arrogance of unchecked power. Instead, she let him drive away, his taillights vanishing into the night, leaving her trembling in the shadows. The days that followed were a blur of internal conflict. She returned to court, presiding over cases with the same poise as always, but inside she burned. The bruises on her neck, faint but undeniable, were constant reminders of her ordeal. She replayed the encounter endlessly. His sneer, the crushing weight of his arm, the cold certainty in his eyes that he could treat her however he pleased. For the first time in years, she considered stepping down from the bench. How could she uphold the law when she had been brutalized by it? How could she maintain faith in the system when the system had nearly stolen her breath? But Althea's resolve was not so easily broken. She filed a formal complaint, though she knew how often those complaints disappeared into bureaucratic voids. She also knew that Creighton's record was already stained with similar allegations. This time, however, the evidence would not vanish so easily. The resident who witnessed the assault provided a statement. The bruises on her neck were photographed, and when the complaint landed on the desk of the district attorney, jaws dropped at the revelation of who the victim was. News traveled quickly through the courthouse halls. Whispered conversations grew louder, shock spreading as colleagues realized that one of their own had been assaulted by a police officer. Some expressed outrage. Others urged her to let it go quietly, to avoid controversy, to protect the fragile partnership between judges and law enforcement. But Althea refused to be silenced. When the indictment came, Officer Daniel Creighton was charged with assault and abuse of authority. His arrogance faltered for the first time when he learned who had filed the complaint. Still, he told himself she would not follow through. Judges, he thought, lived in ivory towers. They didn't dirty themselves with vendettas. He was wrong. Weeks later, the case was assigned to a courtroom. By sheer twist of procedural fate, or perhaps poetic justice, it landed directly on Judge Althea Monroe's docket. She read the file slowly, her heart pounding as she recognized the name. Daniel Creighton. The man who had pressed the life from her body now stood accused in her courtroom. When word reached him, Creighton scoffed. He told his lawyer it was a conflict of interest, that surely she would be recused. He convinced himself the system would protect him, as it always had. But the law was clear. Unless she stepped aside voluntarily, she could preside. And Althea had no intention of stepping aside. The tension in the courthouse reached a fever pitch as the trial date approached. Whispers of bias swirled, police unions protested, and media outlets seized on the scandal. Judge to oversee case against cop who assaulted her blared across headlines, igniting debates about power, race, and accountability. Some called for her to recuse herself. Others saw her involvement as the only way justice could truly be done. Through it all, Althea remained steady. She did not give interviews, did not lash out publicly. Instead, she prepared herself for the trial, determined not to let personal rage dictate her judgment, but also unwilling to allow his brutality to vanish beneath paperwork and politics. She would not be silenced. Not this time. As the first day of trial dawned, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, cameras lined the steps outside, and curious citizens crammed into every available seat. The air was thick with anticipation. And then the door opened. Officer Daniel Creighton, dressed in a suit far too sharp for the gravity of his crimes, walked stiffly into the courtroom. His eyes scanned the room, full of the swagger of a man who had always gotten away with it. But then his gaze landed on the bench. Judge Althea Monroe, robed in black, gavel resting at her side, stared down at him with the unflinching authority of both victim and arbiter. His face paled, his breath caught, and for the first time, Daniel Creighton looked stunned. The man who had once crushed her beneath his weight now stood powerless before her. And the trial was about to begin. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Officer Daniel Creighton took a seat at the defense table. His attorney leaned in, whispering frantic reminders about strategy, but Creighton's eyes remained fixed on the bench where Judge Althea Monroe presided. He had walked into countless courtrooms over his career, testifying with the confidence of someone certain that the badge on his chest would shield him from consequence. But never before had he been forced to face one of his victims, and certainly not a victim who now controlled the proceedings. The irony was almost unbearable. Reporters scribbled furiously, camera shutters clicking in the hall outside, and murmurs spread like wildfire through the crowded gallery. Everyone knew the backstory. Everyone was waiting to see if justice would finally slip through the cracks, or if this would be the rare moment when the system held one of its own accountable. "Court is now in session," Judge Monroe said, her voice steady and commanding. No hint of the fear she had felt that night lingered in her tone. She was not here to relive her trauma. She was here to uphold the law. And that required discipline. The prosecution began with careful precision, laying out a timeline of the evening. They introduced the neighbor who had witnessed the assault, a young woman named Brianna who lived in the apartment complex. Nervously, Brianna recounted how she had stepped outside that night to take out the trash and had seen Creighton slam the woman against her car. She described the way his forearm had pressed into Althea's neck, how she had gasped for air, how the officer's aggression seemed unnecessary and unprovoked. As Brianna spoke, the courtroom hung on her every word. Creighton's jaw clenched, his eyes darting between the witness and the jury. For the first time, his usual confidence seemed to falter. The prosecution then presented photographs of Althea's bruises. Though faint by the time they were documented, the images told their own story: discoloration across her throat, faint impressions where pressure had been applied. Medical reports confirmed soft tissue damage consistent with choking. The defense countered with a familiar refrain: the officer had acted within reason, suspecting potential danger. Creighton's attorney leaned heavily on his client's years of service, painting him as a protector unfairly vilified in a climate of hostility toward law enforcement. They suggested Althea had been uncooperative, that she had escalated the situation by refusing to comply with commands. It was an argument the jury had heard before in countless cases of police misconduct. But this time, the victim was not invisible. This time, she sat elevated on the bench, commanding the room with her very presence. The pivotal moment came when Creighton himself took the stand. His attorney urged him to maintain composure, but arrogance leaked into every word. He described approaching a suspicious individual in a high-risk area. He claimed she had reached into her bag abruptly, forcing him to restrain her for officer safety. He spoke with the practiced authority of someone used to having their narrative believed. But then came the cross-examination. The prosecutor wasted no time dismantling his story. "Officer Creighton," she began, her tone sharp, "did you know the woman you assaulted that night was a sitting judge?" A flicker of panic crossed his face. He shifted uncomfortably. "No, I did not. Would it have mattered if you did?" He hesitated, eyes darting to the jury. I act the same with everyone." That answer hung heavy in the air. For the first time, jurors seemed to grasp the deeper truth. If this could happen to a judge, what chance did ordinary citizens have? The prosecutor pressed harder. Why had he escalated physical force against an unarmed woman? Why hadn't he called for backup if he truly believed she was dangerous? Why were his reports riddled with inconsistencies? Each question stripped away another layer of his defense until what remained was a portrait of bias and abuse of power. As Creighton squirmed on the stand, Althea sat silently, her face unreadable. But inside, her heart pounded. She was not supposed to be part of the story, yet she was the story. Every word reminded her of the fear that had gripped her as his arm pressed into her throat. And yet, here she was, alive, powerful, refusing to let him erase what he had done. The climax reached its peak when the prosecution asked the final, devastating question. "Officer Creighton, do you deny using a chokehold on Judge Monroe that night?" The room fell silent. Every eye turned to him. His lawyer shifted nervously, urging him to stay calm. "I restrained her," he stammered. "I didn't choke her." "Then explain the bruises. Explain the witness testimony. Explain why a woman with no weapon, no record, and no resistance was left gasping for air." Creighton faltered. His face flushed, his confidence cracked, and for the first time, the courtroom saw the truth. He had no explanation. The jury's eyes hardened. The gallery murmured. And Judge Althea Monroe, though silent, felt the tide turning. The man who once held her life in his grip now squirmed before justice, and the scales, so often tipped against people like her, seemed, for once, to be tilting in the right direction. When the testimony concluded, the courtroom erupted in restless whispers. The tension was unbearable, every person in the room sensing they had witnessed something extraordinary. The trial was not yet over, but the power dynamics had shifted irrevocably. For years, Creighton had relied on the shield of his badge. But in that moment, under the gaze of the woman he had brutalized, stripped of excuses and lies, he was nothing more than a man exposed by his own prejudice. And the verdict was coming. The jury deliberated for hours, though to those waiting in the hushed corridors of the courthouse, it felt like days. The building seemed to hold its breath. Reporters filed updates, activists gathered on the steps, and police officers paced the hallways, bracing themselves for the fallout. The question hung heavy in the air. Would accountability finally prevail, or would the system once again bend to protect one of its own? Inside her chambers, Judge Althea Monroe sat alone. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything. She thought of her parents' lessons, of her father's words about progress being earned, not given. She thought of the men and women she had defended as a young attorney, their stories dismissed, their cries ignored. She thought of how close she had come to becoming another name whispered in grief, another story filed away as tragedy. And then, she thought of the jury, ordinary citizens now tasked with deciding whether the law would live up to its promise. She had seen too many cases where the truth was clear, but the verdict betrayed it. This time, she prayed it would be different. When the bailiff knocked gently on her door, announcing that the jury had reached a verdict, she stood, adjusted her robe, and took a long breath. Whatever came next, she would face it with the dignity that had carried her this far. The courtroom filled once more, the energy electric and anxious. Families held hands, reporters perched on the edges of their seats, and Officer Daniel Creighton sat stiffly, his jaw set in forced confidence. But the sweat on his brow betrayed him. His career, his freedom, his entire identity as an untouchable officer, all of it now hung in the balance. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The foreperson rose when called upon, a folded slip of paper in hand. The air was so tense it seemed the walls themselves leaned closer to listen. On the charge of assault under color of authority, the foreperson read, voice steady, "We find the defendant guilty." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some clapped hands over their mouths in shock. Others whispered prayers of relief. Reporters scrambled to capture every reaction. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stand still, suspended between disbelief and vindication. Creighton's face drained of color. His lawyer slumped, defeated, shuffling papers with trembling fingers. The officer who had once smirked as he pinned a woman against her own car now sat powerless, crushed beneath the weight of justice he could not escape. But it wasn't over. On the charge of abuse of authority, the foreperson continued, "We find the defendant guilty." The final words landed like thunder. In that instant, the courtroom erupted. Some wept openly, others raised fists in silent solidarity. Outside, the news spread like wildfire, igniting celebrations and debates across the city. For the first time in recent memory, a police officer had been held accountable for his violence, not shielded, not excused, but judged and convicted. Judge Monroe remained composed as she delivered the sentencing. Her voice did not waver, though her heart beat with both triumph and sorrow. She sentenced Creighton to several years in prison, citing not only his assault on her, but also his documented history of excessive force. This was not just about one night, she reminded the courtroom. It was about a pattern of abuse that could no longer be ignored. And then she spoke words that would echo far beyond the courthouse walls. "The law does not exist to protect power," she said firmly. "It exists to protect people. No badge, no robe, no title, no skin color places any of us above accountability. Tonight, this court affirms that truth." Her gavel struck the desk, and with it, history shifted. In the days that followed, the verdict reverberated across the nation. Civil rights leaders hailed it as a watershed moment. Communities that had long felt silenced found hope in the outcome. Even skeptics admitted that, for once, The scales of justice had tilted toward fairness. The image of Judge Althea Monroe sitting above the man who once tried to strip her of dignity became a symbol, a story told in living rooms, classrooms, and pulpits across America. For Althea, the aftermath was complicated. She received threats from police unions, hate mail from those unwilling to accept the verdict. But she also received letters of gratitude from mothers who had lost sons, from fathers who feared for their daughters, from young law students who now believed change was possible. Each letter reminded her why she had chosen this path, why she endured the scars of that night not in silence, but in defiance. She had not asked for this story, but it was hers now. And with it, she carried a renewed commitment to justice, not the hollow version so often promised, but the kind carved out through courage, risk, and unwavering truth. The city moved on, as cities always do, but something lingered. A lesson, a reminder, that even in a system built on centuries of inequality, moments of accountability were possible. That even when power seemed unbreakable, a single act of resistance, a single refusal to be silenced, could change everything. Judge Monroe knew the fight was far from over. She knew there would be other cases, other battles, other nights where justice hung by a thread. But she also knew that what had happened in her courtroom proved something essential, that no one, no matter their uniform or their arrogance, was beyond the reach of justice. And for every person who had ever been told their voice didn't matter, her story stood as living proof that it did. So when the lights of the courthouse dimmed and the cameras moved on, Judge Althea Monroe carried herself forward, not just as a survivor, not just as a judge, but as a woman who had faced the system head-on and emerged unbroken. Her message was simple, but it resonated powerfully across generations. Justice belongs to all of us, or it belongs to none of us.